The morning Marco Vega stopped writing was the morning the lights appeared over the ridge. He hadn't noticed them at first. He was sitting at the kitchen table in the rented house outside Teruel, a house he'd chosen for its distance from everything, from the city, from the phone, from the people who expected another book from him and kept calling to ask when, and he was staring at the blank document on his laptop, the way a man stares at a wall he knows he has to punch through but can't quite make his fist move. 3 years since the last one. The last book had been a Western. Before that, a detective thriller. Before that, another Western. His publisher called them genre entertainments. Marco called them rent money. He'd been writing them since he was 26, knocking out one every 9 months, and now at 43 the words had simply stopped coming. Not slowed, stopped. As if a tap had been turned off somewhere in the back of his skull and no one had bothered to leave him the key. He poured another coffee. The mug had a chip on the rim that he kept putting his lip on by accident. He'd been meaning to throw it away for 2 weeks. Outside the kitchen window, the ridge that separated his rented isolation from the road was dark except for the stars, which were plentiful and cold in the way that Spanish upland stars always were in October. And then, there they were. Not the stars, something else. 2 lights, white and steady, just above the crest of the ridge, hovering with the patience of a thing that had all the time in the universe. Marco Vega watched them for a moment. Then he put down the chipped mug, decided the lights were a drone or a helicopter, and went to bed. He did not write anything that night. The lights came back the next evening. He was returning from Kanka's place. Kanka, who lived 12 kilometers up the valley in a farmhouse she'd inherited from her grandmother, and who had known Marco long enough to have stopped asking about the books and started asking about his health instead, which was in many ways more insulting. She had fed him lamb stew and given him a glass of wine that was too good for the region and told him, not unkindly, that he looked like a man who had stopped eating regularly. He had kissed her and driven away before she could finish the sentence she was clearly building up to about therapy. The road back cut through a narrow arroyo. The headlights of Marco's car pushed against the dark ahead of him, finding the road's edge and the pale limestone cliffs on either side. He was thinking about the stew, actually, and about whether Kanka was right about the therapy, and about whether the 2 thoughts were related when the front left tire blew out with the sound of a cannon. The car lurched. Marco had driven on bad roads in 3 countries, and his hands moved before his brain did, correcting the pull, riding the rim, feeling the left side of the car dragging against the gravel shoulder. He got it stopped, sat in the rocking silence with his heart making its presence known against his ribs. He got out, stood in the cold air of the arroyo looking at the flat tire, looked up because a man always looks up when he gets out of a car at night on a lonely road, and found the lights again. Not on the ridge this time. Closer. Perhaps 100 meters above him, hanging in the black sky with that same terrible patience, that same terrible stillness. Then the car began to move. Not under his power, not under anyone's power he could explain. It moved sideways, the gravel crunching beneath the rims, sliding toward the edge of the arroyo where the shoulder dropped away into the dry creek bed below. Marco had time to grab for the door handle and miss it, time to think a single word that he would later be unable to remember, and then the car slipped over the edge and rolled into the dark below with the sound of breaking glass and tearing metal. He stood at the edge, stared down at the wreckage, looked back up at the lights. The lights, for the first time, moved. They banked away to the north and disappeared behind the ridgeline. Marco Vega stood in the arroyo in the October dark for a long time. Then he walked back to his rented house and made a second pot of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and wrote 800 words about a man who survived something he couldn't explain. It wasn't a Western, it wasn't a detective thriller, but it was words on a page, and for the first time in 3 years his hands didn't want to stop. He would later think of this as the last clean night of his old life. His name, his real name, not the xenological designation that had been assigned to him by the catalogers, was Vreth, though names in his culture carried weight the way stones carry weight. They accumulate, they compress, they cannot be lifted alone. He was the third pattern acquisitor of the Ganim succession, which was an honorific that translated imperfectly into anything a human tongue could form, but which meant roughly he who retrieves what is required for the advancement of understanding. In practice, this meant he was a collector, a scientific collector, the most specialized and, on his homeworld, most respected kind. He had been watching the human for 11 of the planet's rotational cycles. The research vessel, which the humans would have called a flying saucer, a term Vreth had encountered in their cultural data archives, and found both charming and reductive, hung in the upper atmosphere above the Iberian Peninsula, visible only at low altitude when the approach team descended for closer study. Vreth himself rarely descended. He reviewed data, he observed, he cross-referenced behavioral indices. He was not a field operative, he was a scholar. The reason they had chosen Marco Vega was documented in 340 pages of xenosociological analysis, and could be summarized, though the summary pained Vreth as summaries always did, in a few key points. The human was a creator, not merely a tool user, not merely a communicant, but a generator of entirely novel conceptual structures that bore no direct relationship to survival need. His books were fictions. He invented characters who had never existed, situations that had never occurred, worlds that had no physical counterpart, and he did this not because his species' survival depended on it, but because something in his neurology generated the compulsion, and something in his culture had decided this compulsion had value. This was, from a Ganim perspective, almost incomprehensible. The Ganim created only what they needed. Art, in the Ganim sense, was applied mathematics. Music was frequency optimization. Architecture was material efficiency. The idea that a biological entity would spend the majority of its waking hours producing deliberately false accounts of events that had never happened, and that other members of its species would pay currency for the privilege of ingesting these false accounts. This was, when Vreth encountered it in the data, the most alien thing he had ever confronted, more alien than the biology, more alien than the chemistry, more alien even than the emotional volatility that made every human interaction look, from the outside, like a catastrophe in slow progress. He wanted to study the human's creative mechanism directly, not via long-range scan, not via cultural data mining. He wanted the human in a controlled environment where the process could be observed, documented, interrogated. The human's consent was not a variable Vreth had been asked to factor. He had expressed reservations, quietly, in the way Ganim scholars expressed reservations, through a formally submitted addendum to the mission parameters, filed on day 3, acknowledged on day 9 with a notation that the Ethical Review Board had reviewed and approved the mission parameters on their original submission date, and that therefore the addendum constituted a concern logged rather than a concern addressed. Vreth had read this notation. He had read it twice. He had then done what Ganim scholars did with concerns that were logged rather than addressed. He filed a second addendum, and he went back to work. The approach team were not scholars. They were biological retrieval specialists, 3 of them, heavily modified for physical exertion and environmental resistance, their original biology so thoroughly augmented that calling them Ganim was somewhat approximate. They did not have names in the way Vreth had a name. They had designations. Vreth sometimes found himself using the word soldiers in his internal notes, then correcting himself, though he was never quite sure what he was correcting himself toward. He watched the feed from their optical sensors as they descended. He watched the human's car go over the edge of the arroyo. He watched the human stand at the edge and look up. The human, Vreth noted, did not run. The human did not call for help. The human looked at the fallen car, looked at the lights, and then stood very still in the arroyo cold and appeared to think. This was interesting. The human then walked home, which was not what the behavioral models had predicted. Vreth cross-referenced 3 separate models, found all 3 had predicted either flight, shock paralysis, or aggressive response, and filed a 3rd addendum noting that the existing models might require revision. He then began preparing the containment specification for the human's arrival. He was, in his own disciplined and methodical way, looking forward to it. Inspector Felicia Aguado of the Terrell Municipal Police had a face that had learned, over 16 years of other people's disasters, to maintain careful neutrality. She looked at the wreckage of Marco Vega's car at the bottom of the arroyo, and she looked at Marco Vega sitting on the front steps of his rented house wrapped in a blanket, and she looked at the statement he had given her, and she maintained careful neutrality throughout all of it. There were lights, she said. Yes. And the lights moved the car. They were above the car, and then the car moved toward the edge. Make of that what you want. Felicia made a note. She had seen stranger things in 16 years. Not much stranger, but stranger. She looked back at the arroyo where her colleague was photographing the wreckage. The tire blew first, she said. Yes. Could the car have rolled on its own, if the blowout sent it toward the shoulder? It moved sideways, Marco said. It slid perpendicular to the road for about 4 meters before it went over. Cars don't do that. Felicia made another note. She had the particular professional patience of a person who knows that what they are being told is probably true, and who also knows that putting it in the official report exactly as stated will create problems in 3 separate departments. The lights are gone now, she said. Yes. The car is at the bottom of the arroyo. Also yes. And there's nothing left to photograph or measure or document except the car. Marco looked up at the sky. Empty, cold, the stars back in their correct positions doing what stars did, which was nothing conspicuous. Nothing's there now, he agreed. Felicia closed her notebook. She would write it as a single vehicle accident on a poorly maintained rural road, tire failure, no other vehicles involved, driver uninjured due to exiting the vehicle before impact. She would file the report by end of week. She would not mention the lights. She was a careful woman. She gave Marco her card before she left, the way she always did when people told her things she couldn't put in the report. It was the best she could do. Marco put the card on the kitchen table next to the chipped mug and sat down and wrote for another 3 hours. He wrote about the lights. He wrote about the thing that was waiting in them. He didn't know yet what it was, but he could feel it there in the story the way you could feel weather coming before it arrived, a pressure change in the air of the narrative. He wrote about a man who had his car taken away from him and was left standing in the cold with nothing but his own thinking, and he wrote that the man was not frightened. He was curious. This was not, Marco knew, entirely autobiographical. He was, in fact, frightened, but he found that writing about the man who wasn't gave him somewhere to put it. The second team found him 3 days later. Not the same team. These were different, slower, more physical, moving with the particular deliberate grace of things that had been engineered for endurance rather than speed. Marco had gone for a walk in the early evening, up the ridge path that he'd been meaning to take for weeks, because the sky was clear and the light was good, and he was stuck on a chapter and walking had always unstuck him. He was not thinking about lights. He was thinking about his character, a woman named Alina who kept appearing in the new manuscript without his having invented her, arriving in scenes he hadn't planned for, saying things he hadn't written yet when he sat down. He heard them before he saw them. A sound like static, like television snow given physical form, a crackling in the dry air. Then the 2 of them stepped out from behind a limestone outcrop at the bend in the path, and Marco had perhaps a full second to register that What he was looking at was not human before the first one raised its arm, and the crackling intensified, and the world went white. He woke up on the floor of his kitchen. All the lights were on. He had no memory of returning home. His watch said 4 hours had passed. On the table next to the laptop, there was a mug of coffee, not the chipped mug, a different one, a mug he didn't own, and it was warm. He did not touch the coffee. He sat down, hands very steady, and opened the laptop. He wrote down everything he remembered before the white, the crackling sound, the limestone path, the two shapes, the deliberate patience in the way they moved. He wrote it down in the new manuscript, as fiction, inside the head of a character who he was only now beginning to understand, was not entirely himself, but was built from him, the way a cast is built from the original. Then he called Kanka, not to tell her what had happened. He wasn't ready for that, and more practically, he wasn't sure she would believe him, but because he needed to hear a voice that had known him long enough to require no explanation. "You sound different," she said. "I'm writing again." A pause. Actually writing, or the thing where you open the document and close it and call that writing. Actually writing, something real this time. "Is it good?" He looked at the mug that wasn't his. "It's about something that's actually happening," he said. "So I suppose it has to be." Kanka made the sound she made when she was deciding whether to ask the follow-up question. She decided not to. "Come for dinner tomorrow," she said. "Bring the pages if you want someone to read them." He said he would. He didn't sleep that night. He wrote instead, page after page in the kitchen with every light on in the house, and somewhere around 3 in the morning he wrote a sentence that stopped him cold. She had come looking for something she didn't have a word for, and she was beginning to understand that finding it might not require her to take it. He stared at that sentence for a long time. He had no idea where it had come from. He saved the document and went to watch the ridge until sunrise. Vreth was distressed. Not emotionally, in the human sense. The Ganem did not do distress in that high-frequency, high-visibility way. Vreth's distress was a precise and localized phenomenon, a recalibration of expected outcomes, the quiet systematic dismantling of assumptions that had been load-bearing, the particular unease of a scientist whose subject was not behaving within documented parameters, and who suspects that the parameters themselves may be the problem. The human had not been retrieved. The approach team had made contact. They had used the induced sleep field, which should have been sufficient, which had in every documented application on human subjects been sufficient. And the human had woken on his own floor 4 hours later and appeared to have driven himself home. Except he couldn't have driven himself home because his car was at the bottom of an arroyo. The human had walked home, in the dark, with no apparent distress response. And then, based on biometric monitoring, he had spent the subsequent 7 hours doing what human biological signatures identified as creative work. The human was writing. About them. This was not unexpected. Human pattern recognition was well documented, and the impulse to narrativize experience was among the species' most consistent traits. The specificity of it, however, was unexpected. The human was not writing about lights in the sky, the generic shorthand that appeared in human cultural archives by the thousands. He was writing about the way the approach team moved. He was writing about the decision process that sent them, the institutional machinery behind the mission, rendered in fictional form but recognizably accurate in structure. He was writing about a scientist at a remove, watching through instruments, who found himself increasingly uncertain about the ethical validity of what he was doing. Vreth read this last detail 3 times. He then called up the human's complete biometric record and cross-referenced it against the cultural archive. The human's prior work, the westerns, the detective thrillers, all operated on the same basic narrative principle: pursuit and resolution. A problem presented itself. It was chased down. It was solved or failed to be solved, but the arc was always pursued. This was consistent with much of what Vreth understood about human fiction: conflict, resolution, endpoint. The new work was different. The new work did not seem to be moving toward resolution. It was moving toward contact, toward a conversation that hadn't happened yet but that the human was, apparently, clearing space for. Vreth read the biometrics again. The human was by every measure afraid. The fear response was consistent and readable, and yet the human was not leaving, not calling the police in any meaningful way, not as far as the sensors could determine, arming himself or fortifying his position. Instead, he was writing. He was processing his fear through the production of elaborate fictional structures, and he was, within those structures, working toward something. The human was, Vreth realized with a slow chill, that was entirely intellectual rather than biological, doing what Vreth himself did. He was doing research. Imprecise, instrument-free, narrative research, but research nonetheless. He was trying to understand what was happening to him. Vreth sat with this for a very long time. The research vessel hummed around him. Below, in the Spanish uplands, the human's kitchen lights made a warm square in the dark. The fourth addendum Vreth filed that night was the longest and the most carefully worded. It noted that the conventional retrieval approach had failed twice. It noted that the human subject had demonstrated exceptional adaptive intelligence, and that this intelligence was precisely the quality that made the human scientifically interesting. It noted, with all the dry, careful language Vreth had spent a career perfecting, that capturing a subject against its will tended to alter the very qualities one intended to study. That a frightened subject was a changed subject. That the Ethical Review Board, in approving the original parameters, had perhaps not fully modeled the scientific cost of those parameters. It noted at the end that there was another approach. He did not know if the approach would be approved. He prepared it anyway. The Ganim had a word. Vreth tried to find its human equivalent and found only approximations, for the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands rather than the head. They used it primarily in craft contexts, the way a particular weave pattern became known to the weaver's fingers before the weaver could articulate the pattern structure, the knowledge that moves faster than language. Marco Vega had something like it with his writing. He always had. It was the thing that made the Westerns work, underneath the formula, not the gunfights or the frontier geography, but the human texture in them, the small gestures, the way a character would fiddle with the same belt buckle when he was nervous, or the way two people who'd been through something together didn't need to finish their sentences. This was the texture his publishers called authentic, and his readers called, I don't know, it just feels real, and which Marco himself had never been able to fully explain. He didn't think it, he just knew it. He knew, therefore, before he opened the front door on the morning of the 8th day, that what was on the other side of it was not entirely dangerous. He opened it anyway. The thing in his doorway was approximately his height. It was wearing something that was clearly intended to look like ordinary clothing, gray slacks, a dark jacket, but which draped wrong, as if the shapes beneath it were not quite the shapes the clothing had been designed for. Its face was humanoid in the broad architecture of it, the bilateral symmetry, the placement of sensory organs, but the proportions were off in ways that registered as wrong before the brain could precisely inventory them. The eyes were too far apart. The mouth was placed too high. The skin had the quality of something that had arrived at its color through a process other than melanin. It was carrying what appeared to be a book, his book, one of the Westerns, the third one, from 2011. It held the book slightly away from its body, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else. Marco stood in his doorway for a moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "You better come in," he said. "The coffee's hot." The Ganim Vreth, though Marco did not know that name yet, entered the house. It moved with the particular care of something accustomed to different spatial geometries. It stopped just inside the door and appeared to orient itself, reading the room the way a careful reader reads a first paragraph. Marco poured 2 cups. He put one on the table. He sat down and wrapped his hands around the other one. His hands were very steady, and he was aware that they were very steady in the specific way of someone choosing, consciously, not to let them shake. The Ganem sat down at the table. It did not touch the coffee. It placed the book on the table between them, face up, with the air of something that has prepared for this moment by way of extensive note-taking. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Marco spoke first. "You've been watching me." "Yes." The voice was wrong in the way the face was wrong, not alarming, but calibrated. There was something effortful in it, as if the production of human language required a translation step that was not entirely automatic. "You wanted to take me somewhere." "Yes." "And now?" The Ganem appeared to consider. "Now," it said, "I would like to ask you a question." Marco felt something ease in his chest, not completely but enough. "All right." "When you produce these accounts," the book was indicated slightly, "that have no physical equivalent, when you invent these beings and these situations, what is the purpose?" Marco thought about this. He thought about it seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about, rather than giving the answer he gave at dinner parties, which was somewhere between self-deprecating and evasive. "Understanding," he said. The Ganem was very still. "Not information," Marco continued. "Understanding is different. Information is, the car went off the road. Understanding is, how it felt to stand there afterward, what it meant, what it made you think about the fact that you're alive and the car isn't." The Ganem made a sound that was not quite language and not quite response, but seemed to occupy the space between them. "You can't scan for that," Marco said. "Can you? That's why you need someone in the room." The Ganem said, very quietly, "We did not have the right word for it." Marco nodded. "Neither did I for a long time." The chipped mug was on the table between the coffee maker and the laptop. Marco had finally thrown it away, and then retrieved it from the recycling bin the same morning, which he had thought was stupid at the time, but which he was beginning to understand was not stupid at all. He was a man who told stories about loss, and the mug was a small mundane piece of loss, and keeping it was a way of remembering what loss felt like so he could write it accurately. This was the kind of thing that made no sense to explain, but which, looking at the Ganem across the table, he thought maybe he didn't need to explain. "You can't take it," he said. "Whatever you came for, it's not portable." "No," the Ganem agreed. "This we have begun to understand." "Then what?" The Ganem looked at the laptop. "You have been writing about this, about us." "Yes." "May I read it?" Marco looked at the screen. 312 pages, unfinished, nowhere near finished, full of holes and wrong turns, and at least one character who had arrived without permission and refused to leave. It was the best thing he had ever written. He was almost sure of it. He turned the laptop around. The Ganem read. Marco made more coffee. He sat at the kitchen table across from a being from another world and listened to the house settle in the October morning and thought about Alina, the character who had arrived without permission. She was the one who had written the sentence about not needing to take something to understand it. She had known that before either of them did. He wondered if the Ganem had a word for that kind of knowledge, the kind that arrives before you know you need it. He thought probably they did. The approval of the new approach parameters had not been straightforward. Vreth had expected this. He had, in fact, modeled it with some precision. The institutional resistance would be substantial. The ethical review board would require the original approval to be formally reconsidered rather than simply amended. The senior inquisitors would frame the question as a matter of scientific rigor rather than what it actually was, which was a matter of the senior inquisitors not wanting to acknowledge that the mission parameters they had approved had been wrong. What Vreth had not fully modeled was the speed of the formal reconsidering, which happened in 41 of the planet's hours rather than the 320 he had projected. He attributed this miscalculation to insufficient weighting of the institutional efficiency that attaches to decisions that are, in their substance, a retreat from a previous decision. Institutions, he noted, were faster to retreat than to admit they were retreating. The new parameters were simple. The human subject was to be approached openly. Questions could be asked. Data could be shared. No coercive measures. Duration at the discretion of the inquisitor in the field. Vreth had read the parameters 4 times. He had then done something he had never done before in his career, which was go down to the surface himself. He had reviewed the cultural archives' descriptions of human kitchens. He had noted the prevalence of hot beverages, the frequency with which they appeared in human narratives as social facilitators, the way they provided a physical object around which otherwise charged interactions could organize themselves. He had found in the archive a specific human book that the subject had written early in his career, before the westerns and the thrillers, a short novel that had been neither commercially successful nor widely reviewed, but which struck Vreth, reading it, as the most precise thing he had encountered in any human cultural archive. It was about a woman who found a series of letters written by someone dead, and who read them, and who came to understand the dead person better than the living people around her did, and who did not know what to do with this understanding except carry it. Vreth had brought the book because he thought it was what you brought when you wanted to say, "I have been paying attention." He had not expected the human to open the door before he knocked. He had not expected the coffee. He had not expected the human to say what the human said when asked about the purpose of fiction, the particular directness of it, the way the human had answered not as if Vreth's question was naive, but as if it was a question that deserved the serious answer rather than the dinner party answer, the way the human had clearly sorted these 2 answers into separate categories and kept them separate and knew immediately which one was being requested. The manuscript was extraordinary. Vreth read it in the way he read archival documents, systematically, with cross-referencing, but the effect was not archival, it was something else. There was a character in it who was clearly himself, rendered in fictional form, observed from the outside in the way that a writer observes from the outside, and the character was not flattering exactly, but was not unfair either. The character was a being of great precision and genuine curiosity, who had built such careful structures of methodology and institutional protocol around himself, that he had very nearly lost track of the thing the methodology was supposed to be in service of, which was understanding. Vreth read the sentence about not needing to take something to understand it. He read it 3 times. He looked up from the laptop at Marco Vega, who was sitting across the kitchen table watching him with the patient, non-intrusive attention of a person who has learned to let things happen at their own rate. "You knew this before you wrote it?" Vreth asked. Marco considered this carefully. "The character knew it," he said. "I figured it out by watching her." Vreth looked at the screen again. The character's name was Elena. She was not the main character. She appeared in scenes that the human Marco had described as arriving without his planning for them. She was, by every structural analysis Vreth could perform, the character who understood the situation most clearly and earliest and who said the least about it. "Where did she come from?" Vreth asked. Marco smiled. It was a small smile, not the performance smile that the cultural archive had prepared Vreth to expect from humans in social situations, but a different kind, more interior, the kind that precedes rather than follows a thought. "I don't know," he said. "That's the honest answer. She arrived, I let her stay." Vreth sat with this. The research vessel was invisible above them, hanging in the high blue morning sky, and the approach team was standing down per the new parameters, and the kitchen was warm, and the coffee that Vreth had not drunk was cooling in the cup. We have a concept, Vreth said, and paused, because this was the first time in his career he had offered a Ganem concept unprompted to an alien subject, and he was aware of the strangeness of it. For information that arrives before the mechanism that produced it is understood, we use it primarily in craft, in processes where the hands know before the mind does. Marco nodded. We have one too, he said. Several, actually. Yes, Vreth said. I thought you might. The conversation lasted 11 hours. Marco made 3 pots of coffee. Vreth did not drink any of them, but appeared to find their presence meaningful in a way that Marco decided not to interrogate. They talked about fiction and about the Ganem equivalent, which was not fiction exactly. The Ganem did not make things up, Vreth explained, but they did have a practice of constructive modeling, building internal representations of events that had not yet occurred in order to test the available decisions, and these models, when sufficiently detailed, acquired a kind of independent motion. They began to generate events the modeler had not planned. They had, the Ganem had observed, a tendency to surprise. That's the same thing, Marco said. Vreth was quiet for a moment. I had reached the same conclusion, he said. They talked about the approach team. Vreth described them without euphemism. They were biological modification specialists, optimized for retrieval. They had been given an objective and a method and a timeline, and no variable that accounted for the subject not wanting to be retrieved. They had not, Vreth said, made this decision themselves. They had done what they were designed to do. This was not, Marco said, entirely different from a lot of human behavior, and Vreth said no, and they sat with that for a while. Marco told Vreth about the writer's block, about the 3 years of nothing. He described it not as depression, though his doctor had used that word, but as a specific kind of silence. The way a room feels when the thing that made it a room rather than just a space has been removed. He said he'd been afraid it was permanent. That whatever the thing was that let him build the fictions had stopped working and wasn't going to restart. Vreth listened to this with the absolute attention of a scientist who has just identified a phenomenon that none of his instruments were calibrated to detect. The lights, Marco said. The car, the 2 of them on the ridge, that was when it came back. Because of the fear, Vreth asked. No, Marco said. He thought about this carefully, the way he'd thought about the purpose of fiction. Because of the not understanding. Because there was something happening that I couldn't put in a box, couldn't call anything, couldn't file it as one of the known types of experience. He looked out the kitchen window at the ridge. My brain had been running on the known types for 3 years. Generating nothing because there was nothing new to generate from. And then there was something new, something completely outside every existing category. Vreth made a sound that was very slightly different from his earlier sounds, quieter, with something in it that Marco's narrative instincts identified as recognition. You encountered something that required a new structure, Vreth said. Yes. And the construction of the new structure required this. He indicated the laptop, the manuscript, the 11 hours of coffee and careful talk. Yes. Vreth was silent for a long time, long enough that Marco began to think the conversation was over. Then Vreth said, We have been conducting xenosociological study of your species for what your calendar would measure as 40 of your years. I know, Marco said, then at Vreth's expression. I didn't know, Alina did. She's been knowing things a few hours ahead of me throughout this whole thing. Vreth looked at the laptop screen, where Alina's last scene was still displayed. She was standing in a field at the edge of a story that had not yet resolved itself, waiting for the resolution with a patience that was, Marco had always thought, not resignation but readiness. She was ready for whatever came next. She'd been ready for it before it arrived. In 40 of your years, Vreth said, we have acquired much data, biological samples, cultural artifacts, atmospheric readings, migration patterns, communication frequency analysis, linguistic mapping. He stopped. And Marco said, "And we have very little that resembles what is in this document. This," he pointed to the manuscript, "has more of your species in it than 40 years of measurement." Marco didn't say anything. This was one of those moments where the writer in him knew that what was needed was silence, the space in which a thing could finish being said. "We did not know what to measure," Vreth said. "We measured what we could measure. This," he indicated the manuscript, the kitchen, the chipped mug on the table, the second pot of coffee growing cold on the counter. "We did not know this was the measurement." "You needed the right instrument," Marco said. "Yes." "And the instrument needed to be approached correctly." "Yes." "Not retrieved." Marco said this quietly, not as an accusation, just as a fact being placed on the table between them. Asked. Vreth looked at him. The eyes were in the wrong place, the proportions slightly off, the face arrived at by a different evolutionary logic, and behind it Marco could feel it now in the way he'd always been able to feel the weather coming in a story. Behind it was a mind that was genuinely curious, genuinely open, doing what minds did when they encountered something they hadn't been equipped for, stretching. Asked. Vreth agreed. Marco looked at the laptop. He looked at the chipped mug. He thought about Alina standing in her field, ready for what came next. "I'll keep writing it," he said. "Not for you, for me, because it's mine, but you can read it if you want, whatever I finish." "I would like that very much," Vreth said. "I need one thing in return." "What thing?" Marco picked up the chipped mug, looked at the chip on the rim. "Tell me what Ganheim looks like, the planet, the sky, what it smells like, what you eat, what you do when you're not doing this." He set the mug down. "I've been writing westerns and detective thrillers for 17 years and I'm done with the known territories. I need somewhere I've never been." Vreth was still for a moment. Then he said, "The sky has two sources of light and the shadows always run in opposite directions." Marco opened the laptop. He stayed up through the second night, and into the morning writing what Vreth had told him. The shadows running in opposite directions. The architecture that had no concept of the right angle because there was no gravity strong enough to require it. The food, which was not eaten in the way humans ate but metabolized at the cellular level through a process Vreth had described at length, and Marco had rendered as the sensation of sunlight moving through the body from inside. The absence of music, because Ganheim hearing was frequency optimized, which meant they could analyze sound with perfect precision and never, ever hear a melody. This last detail had seemed to startle Vreth when Marco pointed it out. The implication that perfect hearing was a loss rather than a gain. "You can hear every component of a chord," Marco said, "but you can't hear the chord." Vreth had been quiet for a moment. "I had not considered this," he said. "You might be missing quite a lot," Marco said, not unkindly. Vreth had left before dawn. He had not said goodbye in the human way but had stood in the doorway of Marco's kitchen and looked at the room, the table, the laptop, the 2 coffee cups, the chipped mug, with the expression that Marco had come to read over 11 hours, as Vreth's version of taking careful note. The way a scientist looked at data that was going to require considerable time and a great deal of revised methodology to properly process. "You will finish it?" Vreth asked. "The book, yes." "Will it be true?" Marco thought about this. "It'll be fiction," he said, "which is different from true but not the opposite of it." Vreth appeared to consider this for a moment with the particular attention he gave to sentences that required new frameworks. "I will think about this distinction," he said. "Take your time," Marco said. "It took me about 20 years." After Vreth left, Marco sat in the kitchen as the sky over the ridge went from black to purple to the thin, specific orange of a high-altitude sunrise, and he wrote without stopping for 6 hours. He wrote about the shadows running in opposite directions. He wrote about the scientist who had built so many careful structures of protocol around himself that he had nearly missed the thing he was looking for, and who was now, somewhere in the upper atmosphere above the Spanish uplands, sitting with a revised methodology and a set of concepts that were going to require the kind of structural overhaul that institutional resistance would slow but not stop. Because Vreth was, Marco understood now, the kind of being who filed addendum after addendum until the thing that needed to change changed. This was not dramatic. It was not a rebellion or a revolution. It was just a person, a being, who kept asking the question until the question was answered correctly. Elena appeared in the last scene Marco wrote that morning. She was standing in the field as she always was, but for the first time she was moving not toward anything specifically, just out of the static position she'd held for 300 pages, taking a step, and then another step, going somewhere that Marco hadn't written yet. He saved the document. He made a final pot of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table in the October morning light and understood, with the precision of a man who has spent his life trying to put precise names to imprecise things, what the last 3 years had been. They had been the Ganem equivalent. His brain, running out of known structures, metabolizing old material, waiting for the friction of something genuinely new. The silence before the new territory. He had the new territory now. He had a sky with 2 sources of light and shadows pointing in opposite directions. He had a being who could hear every frequency and no melody. He had Elena, finally walking. He had a conversation about what it meant to understand something rather than merely measure it, a conversation that had lasted 11 hours and produced more material than he'd generated in 3 years and was not finished, not remotely finished, barely even started. He picked up the chipped mug. He'd been carrying it around for 2 months and he still hadn't thrown it away, and now, finally, he understood why. It was a container. That was all containers were, not the thing held but the shape of the holding. The mug was a shape for coffee. The westerns and the thrillers had been a shape for the kind of understanding he'd been capable of at 26. The new book was a shape for the kind he was capable of now. He looked out the kitchen window at the ridge. Empty sky, cold, the stars from last night long since washed out by daylight. He knew they were still up there. He thought about Vreth, sitting in whatever a Ganem research vessel looked like when a Ganem scholar sat in it writing notes that were going to require structural revision of several decades of accumulated assumptions. He thought about the approach team, standing down, doing whatever approach teams did when they were not approaching. He thought about the institutional machinery of an alien civilization encountering, for the first time, a revision it had actually been required to make rather than simply file. He thought they found what they came for. Then he thought, no, they found what they didn't know they came for. That's different. That's better. He opened the laptop and typed the next sentence. Elena was walking toward the second shadow, the one that pointed where the light didn't come from. She had been waiting for it her whole life. She had known it was there before she had the words for it. She moved toward it with the unhurried certainty of someone who was not arriving for the first time but returning, the way you return to the sentence you wrote at 3 in the morning and find it still good in the morning light. Still true, still worth keeping. Marco Vega wrote for the rest of the day and most of the following night, and what he produced was the best work of his life, and it was also, strictly speaking, the most accurate thing that had ever been written about the Ganem people in any language, which was something Vreth would note, with characteristic precision, in the 5th and final addendum, filed on the last day of the mission. The addendum concluded, the most complete and scientifically significant xenosociological document produced during this survey was generated not by this mission's instruments, but by the subject himself, operating without instruments, from the interior of the experience. This method is hereby recommended for all future first contact study. The subject was not retrieved. The subject was asked. The distinction is total, and it should have been obvious from the beginning. And the fact that it was not obvious is itself the most significant finding of this mission. The addendum was approved in 6 hours. For the first time in 40 years of research, the approval was unanimous.